the impetus for places like NAM and this and that, and these nascent sort of like economic ideologies that are developing, the road to serfdom and Mont Pelerin is really sort of like ways in which to re-export this idea internationally, it seems to me. And it comes back to the States, and we start to see the beginnings of like a programmatic idea of both impacting academia, politics, and popular culture. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but
yeah, this is insane to me. I mean, I grew up reading some of this, right? And I did not realize that Little House on the Prairie, which you spend a good amount of time speaking about, was a part of like a libertarian indoctrination propaganda effort. To talk about that a bit, because I think that might blow some people's minds.
Yes, and one of the things that's so ironic about this whole story is all the while these folks who were writing about are massively criticizing the Soviet Union for propaganda, and particularly they reserve particular vilification for what they see as the Soviet attempt to propagandize children. And yet they do the exact same thing. Maybe they recognize it because they know it when they see it. So one of the kind of shocking pieces of this story, and here I want to acknowledge two other scholars whose work we drew on a lot, Caroline Fraser and Christine Woodson. It's the story of the origins of the Little House on the Prairie series. So like millions of other girls, I read those books too growing up and believed that they were the true life story of Laura Ingalls Wilder, a young girl, teenager growing up on the American frontier. That's how they were marketed by their publisher, and that's what I think most of us thought when we read those books. But it turns out it's not true. And it's not true on a couple of different levels. First of all, Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't write those books. She made rough notes for the books based on actual incidents of her life, but they were crafted into stories by her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who was a libertarian thinker, author, and journalist who happened to be friends with Herbert Hoover and was a close correspondent of J. Howard Pugh, the president of Sun Oil Company, and also a major leader in NAM. So there's a direct connection between the Wilders, NAM, and the other business executives that we track in the story. Rose took her mother's notes and crafted them into libertarian parables, emphasizing success through hard work, individual initiative, and no need for help from the government. Well, that was a misrepresentation on at least two levels. It turns out the Ingalls family was not actually successful. Their story of life on the frontier was actually a story of repeated failures, but Rose wiped those away and made it all good, made it all successful through hard work. And the other thing, of course, is that the federal government played a gigantic role in the frontier through the Homestead Act,
right,
through the railroads, and for better or worse, through the removal of indigenous people.
I'd say for worse.
That goes back to the white settler book that we were speaking about, as well as the American conception of freedom also being tied to freedom for whites as we expel or enslave non-white people as well.
Right, and it's also particularly hypocritical on the issue of property rights, which we just mentioned. Rose Wilder Lane was a huge advocate of property rights, as many libertarians are, and she was a very, very influential libertarian thinker. Again, someone who's been mostly forgotten, but was considered one of the three most influential libertarian thinkers in the mid-century. So in her book, The Discovery of Freedom, which is a nonfiction, a book that claims to be nonfiction, although it's filled with falsifications of history, but she makes a very strong point about the centrality of property rights. But of course, underneath all of this is the theft of property from the Native American peoples.
I had a debate with Walter Block. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a big libertarian. He was a Ron Paul advisor and then ultimately became a Trump guy. And he was a professor at, it was like a libertarian sponsored, George Mason, I think, or business professor. And I asked him about that. And his answer from a libertarian standpoint, and I'm not being facetious about this, was, well, we start counting when the white people came over from Europe. That's when we start to count property rights, because of course they can't. And it was the French concept of working the land and creating some other value there. And what the indigenous people in this country did is they didn't mar the land enough to establish it as property, I guess, in some way. But And
I could just interrupt and say Rose Wilder Lane actually uses that argument, which actually goes back to John Locke, who argued that you make property yours through working on it, which of course is a complete effacement of the work that indigenous people in fact did do on their lands in many different ways. But Rose Wilder Lane explicitly uses that, like you say, to kind of reset the clock so that all the stuff that happened before Europeans came, somehow that gets effaced or expunged from history.
That is the amazing thing about libertarianism. It is supposed to be like an eternal sort of ideology that exists in nature, but we decide when that starts. And it just coincidentally starts when we get onto this country, just by coincidence. We should say there was like attacks. There was a real concerted effort. I mean, of no more grapes of wrath. Like these stories can't be told because of the way that they sort of like, portray government's relationship to people and corporations' relationships to people. Tell us a little bit about Norman Vincent Peale, because this is really fascinating. I mean, I guess like I grew up with Reagan and to some extent Carter and Clinton, so I'm that's less of a surprise. We can see they're almost coasting. Well, Reagan's not so much. But certainly Clinton's coasting on a lot of this stuff. But talk about Norman Vincent Peale, because all of this is so important to the way that we interpret information today, I think.
Yes. So one of the things that made this book hard to write is we kept finding more material, more connections, more things that were relevant to the story, which is why, in the end, we ended up with a rather big book. And we like to say it took a big book to describe the big myth. So as I mentioned before, one of the problems that these propagandists had was that their account of history was false. Their account of electricity markets was false. The stories that Rose Wilder Lane told about her mother were false. So they're constantly grappling with having to brush aside the truths of history, the truths of people's lives. But there was another problem that they encountered that was different and in some ways maybe even more profound, and it had to do with our understanding of Christianity. So in the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s, many American Protestants felt that capitalism was not really compatible with being a true Christian. Jesus, after all, had preached a message of love for the poor. Famously, in the New Testament, it says that a rich man can go to heaven as easily as a camel can go through the eye of a needle. So there's this really strong message in Jesus's teachings that could be viewed even as socialistic. And this is a big, big problem for the captains of American industry, and they know it, and it troubles them. And so they decide that they need to do something about it. And the something they need to do is to realign American Protestants with free market economics and to persuade them that that interpretation of Christianity that I've just been describing is wrong, that actually it's fully Christian to believe in a free market economy that doesn't protect workers or children, and in which individuals can amass massive amounts of wealth. And so they do this with yet another project. The project is called Spiritual Mobilization, and it's heavily funded by J. Howard Pugh, the president of Sun Oil Company, who I just mentioned was also a correspondent of Rose Wilder Lane. They fund a minister by the name of James Fifield, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, so a viewer can call in if they know. And he begins to do a number of things. They create a journal called Christian Economics. I'm not making that up. They have newsletters that they send out to ministers across the country, beginning to preach a kind of gospel of wealth, drawing on this idea that people who are wealthy are good people, and that's why God is rewarding them with so much wealth. Trying to influence the curricula in seminaries, and ultimately also supporting a number of charismatic preachers who they believe can be effective in bringing this message. One of those preachers is Norman Vincent Peale, who writes the best-selling book, The Power of Positive Thinking, which, again, not entirely wrong. I think most of us will agree positive thinking does have power, but it's focusing on this idea of individualism, that you can succeed through dint of your own attitude and you don't need the government to help you. Now, two of Peale's parishioners, Mary and Fred Trump. And in later years, Peale
I got to tell you, like the entire time you've been talking about this, I've been holding back my just raging desire to just do a Trump impersonation, going, "It's true, it's true. Everything he's saying is true."
Thank you.
I mean, honestly, like it is. If you want to understand why Donald Trump sitting on that stage in 2016 was completely bulletproof from anything anybody said up there, and you can see this in George W. Bush was like the CEO president, but Donald Trump was really the culmination of that impetus. Like, you know, Paul Ryan talking about sort of like how, you know, this concept of like being, you know, morally righteous. If you're poor, you sort of like morally, you've lost some righteousness. Donald Trump standing on that stage, there was nothing that he couldn't say that wasn't morally more righteous and correct, because he was the richest guy there. And that's it. And was not, and knew enough to deploy that in a way that we've seen like Republican candidates in the past sort of like hold back a little bit. Like I think Forbes ran at one point, the guy with the flat tax. He didn't get out in front because he was ashamed of his money a little bit. He had that old money quality, but Trump, he just realized like, this is what we've been building towards, where, you know, I'm the king because God said so.
I know. And the thing is, we didn't set out to write a book about Donald Trump. In fact, the idea for this book predates Donald Trump running for public office. So it was pretty staggering to us when we found these connections, direct connections to the Trump family, to show and to see, as you just said, the ways in which the foundations for this approach have been laid for a long time and have come to fruition in sometimes really, really frightening ways.
Very frightening ways.